Hello, Tributes, and welcome to the third episode of Tales of Xebec. This episode will be going over the files of the 21st through 30th Hunger Games. I'd like to thank Christian Blanco and Lauren, who wrote Tales of Hunger Games and Panem Reborn, respectively. Also, before we start, I had to change the look of Aria Marchetti as I was transferring Tuppers from the Tupper Box bot from Leah's account to mine. So, I'll show you a slide with Aria's updated look before we start. As always, good luck and may the odds be ever in your favor. The 21st Hunger Games took place in Stockholm, Sweden. The weather was light snow and the games lasted for 8 days. The notable mutts were Angry Moose. After last year's games produced a victor with mixed reviews, the game makers realized that the games needed more pizzazz. Viewers had a thirst for blood and action that could only be quenched by a successful Hunger Games. Luckily for them, the reapings for the 21st Hunger Games were fastly approaching. This year's victor was 18-year-old Astrid Johansson from District 3. When the tributes raised into the arena, most of them looked around at the beautiful surroundings, while others were smart enough to know not to get distracted by the beauty. Astrid was definitely not one of them, however. When the gong sounded, Astrid stayed put for only a second. That second was long enough for Astrid's ally to be killed in the cornucopia. This caused Astrid to run into the cornucopia. When she got into the cornucopia, she grabbed a sword and immediately stabbed the person who killed her ally. She then ran at Annette from 7 and swung her sword. Annette then ducked under Astrid's attack, and instead of fighting back, Annette actually asked Astrid for an alliance. After a few seconds of contemplation, Astrid was about to decline until Audrey from 1 came up behind Astrid and Annette, and Annette threw her sword at Audrey, killing her almost instantly. At that point, Astrid changed her mind and decided to ally with Annette. The two girls then ran into a nearby building and ran up to the top floor, where they watched the snow fall down outside. In that moment, the two girls shared what Astrid described as a romantic moment, sitting in front of a fireplace, holding each other close for warmth. After a few minutes, the two girls fell asleep in each other's arms. Soon, Astrid woke up to the sound of a cannon going off. She looked over at Annette, who also seemed frightened by the sudden sound. The cannon was revealed to belong to Anastasia from 18, after she was attacked by a moose in the middle of one of the streets of Stockholm, as she was being chased by the couriers. Astrid then looked at Annette, and contemplating whether or not to kill her. Annette also looked at Astrid, contemplating the same thing. Eventually, both girls decided not to kill each other yet. Astrid and Annette soon left the house they were camped out in, and Astrid then started to roam the arena. Annette smiled at all the snow on the ground, as Astrid just smiled at Annette. Soon enough, the girls went into a nearby house and sat by the fireplace. This time, the girls just didn't hold each other close. Instead, they kissed and started to get intimate. As the girls got intimate, the camera switched over to the couriers, who were chasing down another tribute. When the girls finally finished getting intimate, they heard the combined sound of 4 boys screaming and their cannon sounding. Annette remarked that the screams and cannons sounded close by, and that the girls needed to find a safer place to hide. Astrid soon agreed to this notion, and the girls started to leave the house. When the girls got out of the house, Zella from 13 came up the girls, with tears rushing down her face, and told them that the careers killed her allies and let her run free. Annette and Astrid then looked at each other before deciding to take the poor, scared girl in with them. Astrid, Annette, and Gisela then went on to try and find a house to hide in. They eventually found a gorgeous pink house on the shore that reminded Astrid of her home back in District 3. The girls ultimately decided on camping out in this house. All three girls huddled together for warmth by the fireplace. Before any of the girls could get any sleep, however, they all heard a cannon. They didn't hear the screaming before it, however, so they thought it was far away. In reality, the cannon was actually right outside the house, when one of the careers found Isabella from 22 and drowned her in the river outside of the house the girls were camped out in. The careers thought that two groups of tributes wouldn't think to hide in the same area and just left. After the careers left the area, the girls silently agreed that if they heard one more cannon, that's when they would fight. Soon enough, they heard something, but it wasn't a cannon. It was the voice of Milena from 20. Milena had brought the careers back to the house that the girls were camping in, bringing up the fact that they forgot to check it. Astrid and the girls immediately jumped up and ran to a hiding spot. Gisela hid behind a bar, while Astrid and Annette hid inside a closet. Astrid and Annette looked out of the crack in between the closet door and the wall in horror as the careers entered the house and began to search. The career came up to the closet the girls were hiding in and almost opened it, until another career found Gisela and called out to the career in front of the closet. The careers then dragged Gisela to the river while she screamed out for help. The careers then dunked Gisela underwater and held her under until her cannon sounded. Astrid and Annette cried as they heard of the cannon. Luckily for them, the careers were just leaving and didn't hear any of it. When the careers were a safe distance away, Astrid and Annette ran out into the street and over to the river and pulled out Gisella's dead body. The 10-year-old girl was a lot heavier than she had been before. The girls then did something unexpected. They put their tokens on Gisella's body. Annette put a photograph of her and her mom in Gisella's hand, while Astrid put a locket with a picture of her and her surely now ex-boyfriend in it around Gisella's neck. The hovercraft then came to pick up Gisella's dead body as Astrid hugged Annette and cried on her shoulder. After the death of Gisela, Astrid and Annette couldn't get any sleep, with the careers still roaming around. Luckily for them, some tributes from the outer districts were about to launch an attack on the careers. As this fight went on, Astrid and Annette heard all the cannons and even jumped a little at a few of them. After the fight, the president got onto the intercoms, congratulating the tributes on making it to the top 10. After this, it was evident that either the outer districts had won the fight, and this would be an easy victory for Astrid or Annette, or the careers had won, and this was going to be a lot more difficult. A few days after the announcement was made, the girls had not heard any cannons, meaning it was obvious that the careers weren't the ones who won, or else they would have still been hunting, or they would have turned on each other by now. Astrid and Annette looked at each other. This is when the pair realized that they were at a good spot to win. Only 2 days after this realization, the girls noticed another thing. It was just them and 2 other tributes. As Annette slept next to Astrid, she slowly got up and walked over to Annette. Astrid then reluctantly snapped Annette's neck. She then burst into tears over Annette's dead body as a hovercraft came to pick her up. After the hovercraft took Annette away, Astrid got up and started to roam the arena. Eventually, she found the remaining duo. This duo consisted of Jane from -1 and Francisco from 1. Astrid then took out her sword and snuck up on Jane and easily slain her. Then Francisco turned around to face Astrid. Francisco reluctantly took out his weapon as well. For being an 11-year-old boy, Francisco held his own pretty well against the 18-year-old girl. After a while, however, Astrid got the upper hand and killed him, making her the victor. After the games, Astrid returned home where she suffered severe PTSD from what she had done in the arena. She was one of the first victors to stay put in her district, however. She tried her best to mentor her tributes, and actually got a lot of her tributes to make it far in the games, and she was actually pretty proud of herself. The 22nd Hunger Games took place in an air balloon city. The weather was clear skies, the games lasted for 6 hours, and there were no notable mutts, as the games didn't last long enough for the notable mutts to be released. Makers implemented. However, a small slip-up on the game maker's part led to the games ending much faster than the capital had hoped. Furthermore, the victor of this year wasn't as popular, and couldn't even stay in their district after their victory. The victor this year was 17-year-old Sofia Kaminsky from District 6. When the tributes rose into the arena this year, they were surrounded by an empty plain, and 12 different colored hot air balloons all behind them. As the countdown began, the game maker warned the tributes that in 3 minutes a poisonous smog would be released into the arena, and the only way to remain safe from it was to take a balloon up into the skies. Initially, many of the tributes seemed ready to book it towards the nearest balloon, but when Viscaro, from 1, shouted in alarm that the only supplies was at the cornucopia, many tributes seemed to become conflicted as whether or not they should risk grabbing some food or flee to safety. When the gong sounded, Sofia was one of many tributes who chose to run towards the cornucopia. A decent number of competitors actually chose to run in this direction. So Sofia was able to grab a handful of food and a small first aid kit, while the careers managed to kill off a good number of tributes. As the countdown hit halfway, Sofia turned to run for the closest hot air balloon, just as the careers managed to kill off both tributes from 3. To her horror, 18-year-old Andel from 8 was already on the air balloon. However, Sofia continued to run in Andel's direction, and to her surprise, the young boy allowed her onto the balloon. As the timer hit 0, all the hot air balloons took off, most not having any tributes in them, while others had 3 at the maximum. Oddly enough, none of the careers were in the balloons, as they had been preoccupied with fighting off the stronger competitors from 7 and 10. As the balloons finished their ascent and poisonous smog began to cloud the ground, a higher number of tributes died off, and left only 10 tributes remaining after the horrific event, most being from outer districts. This alone caused a good amount of discontent in the capital, as they were hoping for longer, more exciting games. At first, Sofia and Andel didn't seem to know what to make of each other. But Rundell told Sophia quickly that he could patch up any holes in the balloon, if need be. Sophia seemed to grudgingly agree to this fact, and told the other tributes that she knew how to pilot the air balloon, so they could steer towards or away from any danger. However, as soon as Ondel looked away, Sophia gazed at the small amount of food she had, and back at the boy, before she forcefully pushed him off the edge of the balloon. The boy's screams could be heard from everywhere in the arena, until he was cut off by the purple smog he disappeared into. Sophia, horrified at what she had done, began to silently mutter to herself that she was scared and did what she had to do in order to survive, but quickly crumpled into a ball and began to sob quietly. Though it was unintentional, this actually helped Sophia remain out of sight from tributes searching for other contestants, and remain alive for the first few hours. During this time, many Capital viewers began to support Regia from 16, who had taken it upon herself to use a grappling hook she had snagged and climb from 3 different balloons and kill off 4 other tributes. When she got to the 4th balloon, however, the 2 tributes from 11 quickly noticed the girl and cut the rope before she could reach them. This only outraged viewers further, with many who had placed bets favoring some of the stronger competitors began to lead boycotts in the capital. Regardless, the games continued, with 7 competitors that refused to move from their hiding spots. After about an hour, Sophia peered out from her balloon to see the heads of all the remaining tributes. After realizing how few there were, she carefully began to steer her balloon in the direction of the 2 tributes from 11. They were confused and nervous about the oncoming tribute, though appeared confident upon realizing it was only Sophia. Sophia, however, quickly leaped off of the balloon and onto another, as the former balloon continued to drift in the 11's direction. The pair panicked, and as the balloons collided, the 11's fumbled, and both ended up falling to their deaths. Tears soundly streamed down Sophia's face, but she simply grabbed a knife that had been left in the balloon by Regia, and looked round her balloon towards her final competitor. When she noticed Kron from 12 clutching a sword a couple balloons away, Sophia emotionlessly steered the balloon to be parallel with Kron's, and then threw her knife up into the other hot air vessel, which tore a huge hole in the balloon itself, and saw it slowly deflate and began to descend. Kron's screams of despair were overwhelming for Sophia, and as the final cannon sounded, she burst into tears as she was announced as that year's victor, and her balloon automatically began to take her out of the arena. After her victory, Sophia was miserable at what she had done, and when she tried to live a quiet life from the victor's village, her fellow citizens of District 6 tormented her and isolated her, calling her the monster of the skies. Sophia eventually moved out of her district, though even the capital didn't want her, causing her to eventually settle in District A0D, where she, with the help of a future victor and her android assistant, lived peacefully and learned to live with her trauma. The 23rd Hunger Games took place in the Crimson Forest. The weather was rain, the games lasted for 3 days, and the notable months were gray wolves. After a game that was considered a failure, the game makers in the capital decided it might be wise to have an arena that was a bit more basic than previous years. but with enough surprises to keep the audience enraptured. This year's victor was 17-year-old Linnea Olson from District 7. Tributes rose into a dense, dark, and foggy forest, and were only just able to see the cornucopia through a misty haze. When the gong sounded, Linnea surged forward and grabbed an axe, only to be met with a knife in her arm, which had been thrown by Thomas from -1. Linnea managed to rip this knife out and hurl it back at the boy, killing him instantly. She crumbled to the ground in pain and had to be dragged away by her district partner, Edvin, without any weapons or food. The pair limped slowly through the dark forest, fog covering their tracks as the cornucopia slaughter concluded. Linnea constantly told Edvin that she was fine, and the pair needed food and supplies, but Edvin continued to argue that they needed to find a place to hide and help Linnea's arm heal. The girl, who was still in pain, eventually agreed to this, only after Edvin assured her that she would look for food and weapons himself once they settled down. The pair ended up hiding in the western corner of the arena, where Edvin helped Linnea hide in a giant leaf pile. As the pair were doing this, however, the red-headed boy from District 11, Ryan, sprung out, horrified by the two other tributes. The pair were quick to reassure him that they meant no harm, and the trio ended up forming an alliance for the rest of the day. As Edvin went off to find supplies, Linnea and Ryan remained hidden, and when nobody was around, spoke in hushed tones about their lives back in their respective districts. The two built up a strong bond with each other, and many likened the relationship to one of a younger brother and older sister, despite knowing the lower odds of one injured tribute and one young tribute. As the day went on, the pair heard several cannon sound, and when the fallen were shown, the pair were dismayed to see the portrait of Edvin in the sky, as he had been killed by Julia from District 15. After he tried to flee after raiding the cornucopia. After all the fallen had been shown, Linnea and Ryan realized that they had 16 opponents remaining. When Linnea awoke the next morning, she was horrified to find herself alone, with Ryan nowhere in sight. She struggled to get herself up, but instantly flung herself behind a tree as the pairs from Districts 15 and 2 passed by her, silently discussing the whereabouts of other tributes. Despite her fearful gasps, Linnea managed to stay silent as the tributes went by, not noticing the girl as they shuffled through the leaves, hoping a tribute might be hidden there. Once they left, Linnea painfully hoisted herself up, only to hear someone softly calling her name. Linnea whirled around to see Ryan holding a bloodied axe and a medical kit, tears streaming down his eyes. He shakily told the girl he got stuff to help her arm, but collapsed into her, sobbing that he had killed someone when he was coming back. Linnea gently comforted the boy and allowed him to cry for a bit longer as he slowly calmed down. He was still clearly upset, but after a bit he managed to stop crying and help Linnea with her arm. After being sponsored with some food, they stayed in their position for the day, remaining hidden from other tributes. The next afternoon, when there were only 5 tributes remaining, Ryan woke up to hear a howling coming from the south. He quickly alerted Linnea to this, and the pair began to climb up trees, realizing the danger that was moving closer to them. Moments later, vicious wolves began to swarm the arena, targeting any tributes that weren't at the cornucopia. Wolves couldn't climb trees, but they managed to leap up and try to nip at tributes. Unfortunately, this led to the death of the male tribute from 2 and Ryan, whose leg was bitten by a lucky wolf, and he subsequently fell to his death. His sudden, painful death shocked Linnea. The girl couldn't. The girl could only loudly sob as she moved through the treetops and towards the cornucopia. When she got to the cornucopia, the final 2 tributes, Anja from the capital and Adrian from 1, brawling down below. When Adrian snapped Anja's neck, he cried out victoriously and looked around for his final opponent. He didn't notice Linnea glaring at him from above, and she lifted Brian's axe with her uninjured arm and hurled it at Adrian's head, sounding as cannon. After her victory, Linnea returned to her district, where she did her best to mentor future tributes from her home. She wouldn't have a mentee win the games for a while, ever, which led her to have strong feelings of hopelessness, until she later adopted a son, whom she named Ryan. The 24th Hunger Games was the 8th triennial quell. The arena was abandoned sea forts. The weather was clear skies. The games lasted for 2 days. The notable mutts were singing sirens, and the twist for this year's quell was that tributes all lacked one of the 5 senses. This year, many people thought that the tributes from District 4 would go further than they did. However, because of the arena, they were quickly targeted and killed off during the bloodbath. This led to a rather surprising victor from the last district anyone expected. The victor this year was 17-year-old Alice Erickson from District 3. The cornucopia this year was on a small rickety fort surrounded by 15 sea forts, all of which contained various items and food supplies. When the gong sounded, Alice was one of many tributes to go towards the cornucopia. However, instead of climbing into the bunker, she dived and hid herself below the structure, as many tributes brawled their way into one of the sea forts. As the bloodbath subsided and most of the careers took off to other structures, Alice climbed into the fort and began to sneak small amounts of food and supplies into her pockets. From her vantage point, Alice could see most of the other structures, and whenever a tribute looked her way, she shifted her position to remain hidden. Furthermore, whenever the careers returned to the cornucopia to rest and tally their kills, Alice would dive into the water and hide herself from them as well. Because many of the careers were blind or deaf, they didn't notice Alice at all. She managed to remain out of sight for the rest of the day. That night, after the portraits were shown, Alice peeked up at the remaining careers, and upon realizing there were 3 of them still alive, she curled up below the fort, resting on one of the pipes. As she did this, however, many of the tributes that were not awake began to hear some gentle singing coming from the outskirts of the arena. As many of the tributes stirred and awoke at this noise, they found many beautiful mermaids singing and calling out to them. These mermaids promised them riches and success, luring them to come out into the water. One of these mermaids called out to Ronaldo from 21, who was on guard for the careers at the time. He seemed confused, as the blind young man could only hear the mutt's voice coming from all directions of the fort. He fumbled away from her in an attempt to defend himself, but ended up falling into the water, where he was quickly silenced by several sirens. A siren called out to Alice, but the girl only stared at the fish figure and kept her distance. Many initially believed this was because the girl was deaf, though her records revealed that she was not deaf or blind, but this was kept from the audience to add more mystery to the games. Many tributes died due to this event, though for Alice, this was what many considered to be her defining moment. She climbed up into the fort and silently killed off the last two careers, as they began to stir from their sleep. With them dead, and her in hold of most of the supplies, she was in a strong position from that point on. Alice decided to stay in her position, using a bow to shoot any tributes that she saw, and the other tributes to stay healthy and full. She did this until it was down to her and the final tribute, Limonov from 21, who surprised her by springing up from the water and into the fort. The two fought wildly, though Limonov uh, eventually stabbed Alice in the ribs from behind with a small knife he had snagged from the ground. However, Alice didn't even flinch at this, and kicked the boy repeatedly in the head until he passed out. She then threw him into the water, where he drowned, and Alice was crowned victor. After her victory, it was revealed that Alice had congenital insensitivity, which didn't allow her to feel pain. This is why she didn't notice the knife, even when she was flown to the hospital for immediate emergency care. Alice lived a quiet life after her victory, remaining in her district and developing a strong bond with Astrid, a former victor of 3. Astrid acted as Alice's close friend and guide, making sure Alice didn't get hurt as she cooked, mentored for future tributes, and went about her daily life. It was rumored that the pair dated, but Alice didn't take on any lovers in her life. The 25th Hunger Games took place in Venezia Malamorte. The weather was clear skies, the games lasted for an indeterminate amount of time, and the notable nuts were pesky piranhas. This arena was ripe for a District 4 victor, but yet again they were targeted immediately. However, the boats in this arena yet again led to another underestimated tribute to dive into the games and come out successfully. This year's victor was 17-year-old Cataline Sabon from District 6. The tributes rose into a beautifully decorated plaza, which featured swords, oars, and long sticks along with other supplies. The gong sounded, Cataline ran forward and grabbed an oar before she turned back and ran towards one of the many canals that surrounded the plaza. As she ran, she noticed a gondola in the center of the canal she was running along, which was being steered by a hooded figure. She called out to the figure, who only tilted their head slightly towards her and muttered, "I demand payment." Cataline appeared confused by this, but after hearing the shouts of several tributes coming from behind her, she rushed to hide behind inside the nearest building. She poked her head out slightly and managed to make out both the pair from 10 and the pair from 22 rush past her and noticed the gondola and its hooded gondolier. The girl from 22 attempted to leap onto the boat, but was met with the same message that Cataline had received. Regardless, the girl hoisted herself onto the vessel and started to help her allies on. However, as soon as she turned her head, the gondolier lifted up their oar, which was revealed to be a scythe, and sliced off the tribute's head. The girl's allies shrieked in horror and immediately turned to run from the boat. As they did so, they dropped some of their supplies, allowing Cataline to have a small meal of cheese cubes and crackers before she looked quizzically back towards the gondola. Cataline cautiously approached the gondolier, being told the same thing she had before. After the hooded figure said this, Cataline held out her oar, stiffening as the gondolier grabbed it and inspected it closely. After a moment, the masked figure lifted their head and revealed a skull-like mask. They held their scythe out to Cataline and responded with "Proceed." Cataline, now armed with a real weapon and a little food, hopped onto the boat without any tributes. She turned back to the Grim Reaper, requesting that it take her through the rest of the arena. The gondolier did this, and Cataline managed to kill off unsuspecting tributes as she passed by them in her boat, including a lone courier that was out hunting. After 3 days of this, the game makers announced that all of the remaining tributes would be taken by gondola to the center of the arena for a final showdown, though each gondola would only carry one tribute. At that time, there were only 5 gondolas, including the one Cataline had already claimed. Most of the tributes managed to make it to the boats, though a few were killed in the process, some by falling into the infested rivers, while others fought their allies for places on the gondola. As the final 5 tributes were escorted to the center, Cataline yanked the cloak off of the robotic Reaper and leaped onto the plaza. This move startled the tributes that came after Cataline, many thinking she was one of the Reapers herself. This caused them to back away from her. After her victory, Cataline returned to District 6, where she lived an isolated life, barely interacting with anyone, even her mentees. She took ownership of a graveyard in District 6 and worked there with her younger sister and cat as company, content with her life. The 26th Hunger Games took place in Bucharest, Romania. The weather was clear skies, the games lasted for a week, and the notable months were lynxes. After last year's games produced a highly unexpected victor, the capital was hoping for another unexpected victor this year, but they were about to be surprised. The victor this year was 18-year-old Luca Vasil from District 14. When the tributes were lifted into the arena, Luca immediately recognized his surroundings. He was at home. He realized he was on his home turf, meaning he knew where to hide. This year, the Career Alliance was never officially formed, especially after Luis from 1 and Lena from 2 got into a massive argument in the training center. Instead, most of the careers either allied with their district partners or went solo like Luca did. As soon as the gong sounded, Luca ran into the cornucopia, grabbed a sword, and ran. He ran faster than he had ever ran before. Luca ran into a nearby building and watched the cornucopia chaos unfold. After the bloodbath, they were already down to 20 tributes remaining. As Luca looked around for supplies, that's when he realized that there was no food and that the dead tributes weren't being lifted up. This led to him assuming that the tributes would have to eat the dead in order to survive, which made him sick. Luca was already starving, but didn't want to eat any of the dead tributes. But he had to in order to survive. Luca walked over to the dead bodies of Luis and Lena and kneeled down next to them. He gagged a little before he started to eat them. They were not very appetizing. In fact, it was the worst meal he had ever had, but at least it was keeping him alive. After he finished, he almost puked. Little did he know that his district partner, Anna, was watching him do this. Anna was an actual cannibal and was waiting for an opportunity to catch a tribute off guard. This was it. Anna ran at Luca and bit into his arm. Luca screamed out in pain and tried to fling her off of his arm. Anna wouldn't let go, however. After taking a huge chunk out of his arm, Luca could finally fight back. Then reared back for another attack. Luca lunged for his sword and grabbed it. Anna bared her sharp teeth at him, and as Luca prepared to use his sword. Soon Anna lunged at Luca again and bit into the same arm she had bit into before, and Luca swung his sword at her. Luca did hit her, and she released her teeth from his arm. Luca also hit his arm. This caused his arm to fall off, because he had cut it off the rest of the way. Luca clutched his arm in pain as Anna prepared to attack him again. Luca looked up from his wound at Anna with a grin on her face. Anna muttered to herself what part of him she should eat first. Luca then took his sword and swung it at Anna as she ran at him. He hit her right in the skull, killing her. Luca then said something that Capitolites had to enhance in order to properly hear. Nothing now. Luca then went back to his hiding space and fell asleep on the ground that night. The next night he heard screaming, followed by a cannon. The number of tributes was dwindling down. There were now only 18 tributes left, including him. The next few days, Luca wandered around the arena, killing tributes and reluctantly eating the dead when he was hungry. Again, he didn't want to, but he had to in order to survive. After a while, he settled down inside another building, as he did every night. He then heard a faint meow, which he immediately recognized as the meow of a lynx. Luca slowly got up and followed the sound until he finally saw the lynx. Luca slowly approached it, and when he got close enough to it, he attempted to pet it. To Luca's surprise, the lynx actually let him pet it. Luca and this lynx immediately formed a close bond with each other. That night, the lynx would start to go hunting for tributes with Luca. The lynx would save Luca's life on multiple occasions, and Luca would save the lynx's life in return. On the dawn of the 7th day, an announcement was made by the president that the final 2 tributes would have to return to the cornucopia. Luca returned to the cornucopia to see Athena from 9. Athena held her own very well against Luca, considering Luca was a career and Athena wasn't. But eventually, Luca got the upper hand over Athena and killed her, making him the victor. After his victory, Luca returned home where he was celebrated for bringing home a victory. But Luca had other plans. Luca planned to adopt the lynx that had saved him in the arena. He even brought his case to court. when the game makers originally didn't agree. But eventually Luca got what he wanted. The Lynx was his. Eventually he moved to a house on the shore of District 14 and lived a happy, quiet life with the Lynx and a girl he had met in District 12 when he was there on his victory tour. He lived a happy life and had 5 kids with the girl from 12. 3 girls and 2 boys. Eventually, Luca would die in his sleep at the age of 150, surrounded by those who loved him. The 27th Hunger Games took place in the Elysium Istanbul Hotel and Spa. The weather was not applicable because it was inside. The games lasted for 2 days. There were no notable months. And the quell twist this year was that tributes would each be given a suitcase with random supplies in it. Due to the quell twist, it was somewhat obvious to viewers what the arena would likely be, even before the tributes were reaped. What they did not expect, however, was the victor that came out of this quell. This year's victor was 24-year-old Dennis Mustafa from District 17. Dennis made the rather interesting decision of running for the cornucopia, even before looking in his suitcase. What shocked viewers, however, was his decision to use his suitcase as a weapon, bashing the heads of other tributes with the heavy item. During the bloodbath, the female tribute from 2 attempted to swing her own suitcase at Dennis, but it was much lighter than his own, and he proceeded to kill her swiftly as well. Dennis proceeded to grab some food from the center and rushed to an elevator that was filled with several tributes. They screamed as Dennis rushed towards them, suitcase at the ready. Fortunately for him, his district partner and sister, Berna, was also on this elevator and helped him slaughter the competition, asking him, "What took you so long?" after they were finished. The pair proceeded to move through the different floors of the arena, killing off any tributes they found, including the last of the career pack. The entire time, Berna urged Dennis to open the suitcase, curious about what was inside. Dennis refused and argued it was a fine weapon as was, and much better than what Berna had received, which were packs of morphine. This snark comment quickly turned into an argument, and the pair bickered loudly to each other as day turned into night. The Capitol viewers actually found this quite comical, even laughing to themselves as both adults passed by the 12-year-old from District 12, who went unnoticed by the pair. The following morning, the pair quickly made up and continued their scout through the arena. They even took some time to rest in one of the hot tubs the arena held, after drowning the tributes from 4, of course. By that time, the tribute numbers were slowly dwindling, with Dennis and Berna both realizing a final showdown could be approaching any hour. That night, as Dennis was turning in for the night, Berna decided to take a sword and go hunt for other tributes. This left Dennis alone, and he was soon spotted by the girl from 12. She immediately snuck up to his suitcase and quietly opened it up. To her alarm, the item in Dennis's suitcase was a giant bomb, which subsequently blew up in her face, killing her off. Dennis awoke to the sudden noise and appeared alarmed, but relieved to see the remains of the dead tribute a few feet away from him. He did not, however, appear happy to notice the absence of his sister, whom he didn't recognize as his final opponent. When he met up again with Berna, the girl immediately attacked Dennis, much to the man's confusion. The battle was long, with Berna sobbing that she loved her brother, but Dennis responding sorrowfully in kind, finally realizing why Berna was attacking him. Eventually, Dennis managed to overpower his younger sister and snapped her neck as quickly as he could. As Dennis was crowned the victor of the 27th Games, he broke down into tears, hugging his sister as he was lifted to safety. After his victory, Dennis remained in the capital, often attending parties and becoming overly drunk, often in attempts to forget his experience in the arena. He was somewhat violent with other victors and mentees, though ended up sympathizing with the future victor, enough to the point that he became a surrogate father figure to them, and even stopped drinking as much for them. The 28th Hunger Games took place in Vienna, Austria. The weather was freezing cold temperatures, the games lasted for 5 hours, and the notable mutts were creepy spiders. After last year's games produced a victor that was very much enjoyed by Capitalites, they were hoping for another interesting Hunger Games to follow. This year's victor was 25-year-old Amelie Weber from District 15. When the tributes were lifted into the arena, Amelie looked around at her surroundings. Just like Luca a couple years ago, Amelie recognized this place as her home, especially the building right in front of her, on the other side of the cornucopia. That building was where Amelie worked as an exotic dancer. When the gong sounded, Amelie ran into the cornucopia and grabbed a sword. She then went on to slaughter all the careers first thing. She then ran off to try and find other tributes. A lot of cannons went off as Amelie ran through the arena. She then figured out why. When she rounded the corner, she saw a massive group of spiders. But not just any spiders, but in fact they were black widow spiders. Amelie screamed at the sight of these spiders and ran away, but as she ran through a spider web where a bunch of these black widow spiders were crawling around. The black widow spiders fell into Amelie's hair and started to bite her. She was able to shake off the spiders, though, although she was in immense pain now. Amelie then continued to run all the way back to the cornucopia. When Amelie arrived, she saw a tribute. She was then informed through the intercoms that this was the final showdown, and this tribute in front of her was the last tribute left aside from her. Amelie ran at the tiny little girl. She was only 13, so when she turned to see 25-year-old Amelie running at her, she just gave up and let Amelie kill her. After her victory, Amelie returned home, where she was celebrated for bringing victory to her district. Amelie celebrated with her peers, but after what she had been through in the arena, she was left with a lasting fear of spiders. The 29th Hunger Games took place in Tirana, Albania. The weather was cold temperatures, the games lasted for 6 hours, and the noble mutts were golden eagles. After last year's games brought a victor with the home field advantage, the capital loved the way she had killed all the careers in the bloodbath, and they wanted more. This year's victor was 19-year-old Agron Hoxha from District 12. When the tributes were lifted into the arena, Agron immediately recognized this place. It wasn't necessarily where he lived, but it was actually close to where he lived within District 12. When the gong sounded, Agron ran into the cornucopia with a newfound sense of confidence. Agron ran in and grabbed a sword before slicing open the neck of his district partner, Amelia. After killing Amelia, Agron ran away from the cornucopia and searched for other tributes. After a few hours, it was just Agron and Lewis from 1. Agron and Lewis went to the cornucopia for the final battle. To the capital's surprise, Agron managed to hold his own very well before Agron finally got the upper hand and killed Lewis, making him the victor. After his victory, Agron returned home, where he wasn't celebrated as much as previous victors were because of how he turned on his district partner in the bloodbath. Some people in his district had started to plan his assassination. Eventually, Agron moved away to District 17, where he would mentor future tributes, and he even built a fatherly bond with a few of them. He lived a happy life until he was murdered at the age of 40. The 30th Hunger Games took place in Edinburgh, Scotland. The weather was rainy. The games lasted for 4 hours. The notable mutts were Highland cows. After last year's games, the capital was hoping for longer games, although they did love the most recent victors. This year's victor was 17-year-old Cameron Stewart from District 10. When the tributes lifted into the arena, Cameron immediately recognized his place as home. She even saw the cows and smiled to herself. When the gong sounded, Cameron ran into the cornucopia and grabbed a knife. As she did this, a lot of tributes ran away from the cornucopia and were attacked and trampled to death by the cows. After realizing this, Cameron turned to Ambra from 12. Ambra was her one and only ally in these games. Ambra looked at Cameron with a kind of suspicious look on her face. She was right to be suspicious, because the next second, Cameron plunged her knife into Ambra's chest. After doing this, Cameron proceeded to kill all the careers in the cornucopia, and then ran off to find more tributes. She searched for a few hours and killed any tributes she came across, until it was just her and Abdil from 12. Cameron ran back to the cornucopia where Abdil was waiting for her. Cameron ran at Abdil and immediately had the upper hand. She knew how to kill a man. She's been doing it the entire game. Eventually, Cameron finally got the upper hand and killed Abdil, making her the victor. After her victory, Cameron returned home where she was celebrated for her victory. She had brought District 10 its first victory, and not only were her friends proud of her, but she was also proud of herself. She eventually moved to District 15, where she started to work as an exotic dancer with Amelie. The two girls got intimate with each other on multiple occasions until the two girls finally made it official and got married 15 years after Cameron's victory. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode of Tales of Xebec. After this slide, I will be showing you all information slides on the victors mentioned in this video. Anyways, next episode, I'll be reading the files of the 31st through 40th Hunger Games. Bye, everyone.